The fluorescent corridors of Halcyon Medical Center gleamed with a quiet, bureaucratic perfection. Polished floors, framed certificates, and the soft, steady hum of life support machines seeping through the walls. Evelyn Mora had grown used to that hum. She had spent 3 seasons here, learning how to read the language of beeps and sighs, how to stitch small kindnesses into the rigid schedule of hospital life. Tonight, however, the air felt charged, as if the building itself held its breath. She had been summoned to Dr. Linwood's study, and the summons carried a gravity the usual calls never did. Dr. Arthur Linwood, head of neurology, was a man whose face had been carved from restraint and whose compliments were rare as sunny days in winter. Evelyn knocked, entered, and found him standing by the window, gazing at the city lights like someone who measured the world in probabilities. On his desk lay a thick file bound with a single black and white clipping, a photograph of a sleek, charred car crumpled against a guardrail. The caption read a name she vaguely recognized, Caldwin Hawke, a name that had once been whispered in boardrooms and on business feeds, a man who'd built a private fortune and a public legend. Evelyn, Dr. Linwood said without turning, his voice steady but edged with something she couldn't immediately place. "We need someone for a delicate case. It won't be easy," she swallowed. "What kind of delicate?" He slid the file across. "Caldwin Hawke. He's been comatose since the crash, a year now. His family has largely withdrawn. They want someone who'll do more than clock in. Someone who'll see to him. I think you should take him." To anyone else, the patient was a vault of money and power, a man whose decisions had shaped entire markets. To Evelyn, he was an anonymous body beneath a white sheet and a network of tubes. Still, when she reached for the file, her fingers brushed the photograph, and an odd, prickling sense traveled up her arm, like a premonition you can't translate into words. She accepted, half because the work needed doing, and half because she wanted to test herself against the impossible. The private suite reserved for Hawke was on the hospital's top floor, flanked by panoramic windows and silent attendants. It had been decorated with a muzzled luxury that felt awkward amid the antiseptic. Heavy curtains, a chaise lounge, and framed modern art that seemed to demand attention it did not deserve. Caldwin Hawke's skin was a pale, fragile paper against the room's wealthy trappings. Tubes entered and exited with meticulous regularity. A ventilator exhaled a methodical breath that had become the room's slow heartbeat. Evelyn moved like a dancer through the rituals of care, washing, turning, monitoring, performing each chore precisely, as though precision might elicit some magic beyond medicine's reach. As she worked, she talked. It had become a habit, narrating her small acts, telling stories of the mundane world beyond the glass. "You'd think," she would murmur, "that someone as used to control as you would have better luck at leaving it behind." Her voice felt ridiculous in the face of such immobility, but she kept at it. The human voice is stubbornly persuasive, she told herself. It can sometimes coax something to life, even when everything else seems frozen. And then, in a moment that felt both mundane and miraculous, he moved, not in any cinematic upheaval, but in the quiet, inscrutable way of something waking from a very long sleep. A thumb found the hem of a sheet and curled. Evelyn froze, a washcloth in one hand, her heart like a trapped bird. She pressed a finger to his wrist and felt a pulse, faint but determined. She reported the movement and Dr. Linwood ordered tests. The EEG readouts flickered, something subtler than menacing, more hopeful. The readings indicated heightened activity in regions that had been dormant. "Not a guarantee," the doctor cautioned, "but a nudge." To Evelyn, it felt like an invitation. In the days that followed, her routine broadened into an intimacy she didn't expect. She learned the cadence of his breathing and the slant of moonlight through the blinds. She sat for hours telling him about trivialities. The new pastry at the corner bakery, a nurse's small victory over stubborn paperwork, the name of her childhood dog. She found herself confessing small things, the ache she felt sometimes when the city pretended not to notice its weary, the quiet litany of hopes she whispered into the margin between shifts. The first week unfurled like breaking lights on a long road. There were small miracles, micro-movements, the flutter of an eyelid, a rise in oxygen saturation. And then, one night, as Eveline bent to wipe a smear of lotion from his jaw, a finger tightened around her wrist. It was barely more than a whisper of pressure, but it delivered a jolt that ricocheted through every muscle and marrow. She looked up to see, impossibly, a lid. Caldwin Hawke's eyelids were thin as tissue. When they parted, his eyes were unfocused, ocean deep and bewildered. For a suspended second, the room rested on that look. The machine's beeping continued, unperturbed, but everything else had fallen away. She felt as though she was witnessing a private resurrection. He tried to speak. The sound that came out of him was a croaked, cautious consonant, more breath than word, but it was enough. His first human sound in a year, and it found its way directly to Eveline's ear. She pressed the emergency button, summoned the team, and amid the sudden flurry of motion and alarms, she held his gaze. There was recognition there, not of memory, but of something quieter, an index finger of the soul that pointed toward the person who had returned him from the long dark. When the doctors asked who she was, he squeezed her hand as if he'd always known, murmured a name that slipped on his own memory, and then, bafflingly, the shape of gratitude. Eveline, exhausted and exhilarated, realized in that moment that the line separating care from companionship had dissolved. She had gone into those pristine halls to perform a duty. She had found herself in the doorway of a story she could not yet imagine finishing. The days after Caldwin Hawke's first stirring were a blur of movement and protocols. EEGs like constellations of hope, speech therapists with pad and pen, physical therapists with orders that read like promises. Eveline's world narrowed to the rhythm of rehabilitation. Small victories measured in micrograms of strength in the tilt of a head that had once seemed fixed forever. The suite filled with clinicians and visitors, with whispered theories and the occasional flinty curiosity from reporters who knocked on the hospital's outer doors and settled for rumors. But in the quiet stretches between tests, when the world contracted to the length of a hand between palms, it was Eveline who was there. Caldwin, he corrected himself to that name the first time he could manage more than a syllable, was a study in contradictions. His muscles, atrophied from a year of disuse, were like pages crinkled from a long, closed book. Yet his eyes held a fierce intelligence, the kind that had once carved conglomerates into empires, the same eyes used to reading contracts and people with the same hungry precision. When he blinked awake each morning, he seemed to surprise himself as much as anyone. There were gaps in his recollection, broad, blank patches where events should have been. But there was also a quiet awareness of loss that had washed over him like an undertow. That was the most challenging thing to watch. Not simply the physical work of relearning how to walk or to swallow, but the slow, patient reassembly of a life. He would lie awake and fumble for the shape of a memory, only to find the seam ripped apart. "I remember flashes," he told Eveline once, voice raw with the ghost of a future that hadn't quite formed. A road, a light, a shape, but the rest is fog. Eveline found herself inventing narratives in the gaps, not lies, but scaffolds to hang hope on. She spoke of small things that might reassure, the certainty of seasons, of warm rain, of bread smell that spreads through markets on Saturday mornings. She read to him sometimes, old poems, fractured essays, anything to fill the silence with human sound. She talked to him not as a ward, but as a man who deserved the dignity of ordinary conversation. As the weeks progressed, anomalies kept surfacing. A faint tightening of a fist at the mention of a name, a slight wince when a particular word was spoken, a flinch at the sound of a glass breaking in the corridor below. These were not responses the machines could measure. They were traces of something more insistent than reflex. At night, when the staff had thinned and the city's distant sirens blurred into a lullaby, Eveline would sit and hold his hand and wonder what it would take to stitch those threads of feeling back into the fabric of memory. Medical reports grew marginally brighter. Neural pathways that had once been ghosted flickered like shy candles. The team called it a favorable trajectory. Evelyn called it a new dawn, tentative and fragile. Physical therapy became ritualized. Parallel bars, weighted steps, the patient's laborious reclamation of a body that had forgotten how to obey. Evelyn's role shifted too, from caretaker to coach, from presence to confidant. There were professional boundaries to respect, of course, but those lines blurred in a place where humanity had to be coaxed from stillness. Caldwin, for all his corporate armor, surprised her with little off-handednesses. A dry joke about hospital cuisine that made her laugh. A wistful question about whether the city of his memory still smelled the same. There were moments of quiet vulnerability that betrayed a man who had been polished by success, but softened by trauma. "I had been invincible," he told her once, watching the city wake from the window. "I thought my hands could move the world. And then I couldn't move anything." He laughed, small and brittle. "It's humbling." Evelyn, who had always measured her worth by the steadying of another's breath, felt an unexpected tenderness bloom. It was not romantic in the way novels paint it. There were too many lines to cross, but it was a warmth that threaded through her actions. In the steadiness of her voice, in the way she adjusted his pillow when he woke from nightmares, in the soft reprimand when he tried to overexert himself in therapy. One night, as Spring leaned into the hospital with a reluctant hand, something unusual happened. They were alone. The lights were dimmed to a compassionate hue. Evelyn was adjusting the duvet, humming under her breath, when his hand brushed her wrist. It was a tentative touch, like a question. She paused, breath caught in a way she refused to analyze. "Do you remember anything?" she asked, because the question had become a litany between them. He turned to her, eyes clear but distant. "Not everything," he said slowly, like someone turning pages. "But sometimes I feel things. Fear, heat, the sensation of betrayal." He swallowed and went on. "There's an image. Breaks, a bright, false light, a figure on the roadside. Watching. That word, betrayal, settled over the conversation like a stain." Evelyn felt the temperature in the room shift. Betrayal implied intention. Intention implied an agent. The mind, when piecing itself together, often threw up more questions than answers. She noted down the fragments he offered, not as irrefutable truth, but as breadcrumbs that might lead to more. The clinical staff labeled his recollections as post-traumatic flashes. They recommended a slow approach. Cognitive therapy, memory reconsolidation exercises, gentle exposure to stimuli that might anchor the missing pieces. Evelyn agreed, but felt restless. There was something in the way he said "watching" that made her feel like the shadow of danger had not lifted. Instead, it had reformed into an outline she could not yet fill. That evening, after the last nurse had checked the rounds and the monitors hummed a lullaby, Evelyn made a choice that was not exactly part of her job description. She opened the hospital's internal archive, poring through accounts of the crash, the police blotter, the accident reconstruction report. The pages were clinical, impotent against the full weight of human consequence. But then she found a note, a line about possible brake tampering that had been filed away as an oddity. It was the kind of detail that might have been shrugged off by a world biased toward accident. The discovery tightened something in her chest. The path forward had changed from mere caregiving to a different kind of duty, to help a man reclaim not just his strength, but his truth. Evelyn closed the file with hands that trembled not from fear, but from a dawning resolve. If someone had tried to take his life, then waking was only the first step. The rest, recovery, reckoning, would require more than medicine. Truth, Evelyn had learned, rarely arrived fully formed. It came in fragments, snatches of sound, a smell that opened a door, a name that made the skin prickle. Caldwin's memory returned in scrapes and shards, each one carrying the weight of an accusation. He remembered the road, the black sheen of rain, the sudden absence of resistance under his foot. He remembered a figure on the verge, an outline like a silhouette in a photograph, small, distinct, and terrifyingly indifferent. He remembered nothing of what happened next. The rest had been a long, intrusive dark. They reconstructed the past like careful archaeologists, mapping the sites of meaning, probing for context. Evelyn helped assemble lists, people who might have had grievances, recent company moves, a web of relationships that could produce motives. Caldwin, when he could bear it, sat with pen and paper and tried to fill in life's missing scenes. There were names he could not place, others that arced like bright flares across the landscape of memory. It was the business records that first produced something concrete. A transfer, large enough to raise eyebrows, moved quickly and without routine explanation. The recipient's name matched nothing in Caldwin's memory, but the bank stamp and the trail of signatures pointed to someone close enough to the company to have access and bold enough to manipulate the rest. Rumors are slippery things, but paper leaves traces that cannot deny their existence. Caldwin's face went gray when the ledger was spread open on his lap. Nathaniel, he breathed. The name was a physical thing, a memory of small cruelties, of a sibling's barbed jokes, of a rivalry lubricated by inheritance and resentment. Nathaniel Hawke, his younger brother by 5 years, had always worn his envy thin. In a family where a legacy was measured in shares and boardrooms, jealousy was as common as coffee at meetings. Evelyn watched the flicker of realization cross his face. "You think he—" He nodded, the motion slow. "He had motive," he said simply. "Everything would have been easier for him, if I were gone." Confronting a family is a delicate, thorned thing. Wealth, unrelated to affection, often produces cold calculations. Accusations produce avalanches. Caldwin's brothers and sisters had their own reasons for privacy during his recovery: legal counsel, public relations, and the avoidance of grief on a publicly visible scale. But when Evelyn and Caldwin began to probe, a picture emerged, not of unified mourning but of guarded distance, of a family protecting its assets and reputations. They decided, cautiously and with medical clearance, to see Nathaniel. It was a meeting arranged to look like a reconciliation, a dim study at the family estate, leather chairs, and a bottle of whiskey that tasted of old decisions. Nathaniel's smile was a practiced thing, thin and arrogant. He had the leisure of someone who viewed the world as a board to be won, as if human lives were pawns in an enduring strategy. "Caldwin," Nathaniel said, voice smooth as he leaned back. "You're awake. Good for you." Evelyn watched him closely. Nathaniel's fingers drummed a rhythm against the glass. "You believe what you found?" he asked, words flat and probing. Caldwin's jaw tightened. "There's a transfer, a wire that matches a man known to conduct staged accidents. He's been linked to other attempts." Nathaniel's face hardened at that, mere annoyance at an inconvenient revelation. "You'll have to produce more than insinuation." There it was. The weaponization of doubt. "And go public? How will that help you?" The officers who came afterward had impatient faces and the kind of legal phrasing that treats relationships like transactions. Nathaniel was taken into custody. The evidence had momentum of its own. He protested in a high, petulant voice, everything from slander to a setup. He swore allegiance to a narrative that painted him as a loving brother estranged only by misunderstanding. The cameras were ravenous. Caldwin, newly returned to consciousness, watched as the world he had built became a theater for both his vindication and his humiliation. In the coming days, there were depositions and lawyerly grid work, and the hospital room became a staging ground for a different kind of recovery. Caldwin's body healed in the glare of a public story about attempted murder. He emerged, step by tentative step, into a life now split between rehabilitation and legal proceedings. The boardroom, the old arena where he had once exercised cold dominion, now required more than return of physical presence. It required moral clarity. Eveline stood at his side throughout, an anchor both literal and ethical. Their bond deepened in that crucible, not romance alone, but a mutual recognition that survival did not automatically beget trust. "You've been given a second chance," she told him once, watching him adjust to the coarse reality of cross-examinations and press briefings. "But second chances ask us to be better stewards." He smiled, gratitude and fatigue braided. "You were part of why I made it through the dark," he said. "I never thought a stranger's voice could mean so much." The truth about Nathaniel's involvement, if it was proven, would be messy and public and full of legal teeth. Yet even as the machinery of justice rotated, there were quieter reckonings, how Caldwin would reshape his enterprise, how family dynamics would be rewritten, and how the man who had once measured value in markets might relearn the currency of affection. Eveline felt an unfamiliar mixture of satisfaction and unease. The knot of danger had been partially untied, but unspooling a past also revealed other threads, alliances, resentments, and secrets in boardroom minutes that might not stay buried. Someone had tried to end a life. Someone else had succeeded in burrowing into the mechanism that made such an attempt possible. The line between business rivalry and malevolence, she realized, can be perilously thin. And in the quiet moments, when the city outside moved on without pause, Eveline wondered which of them, Caldwin, his family, or the unseen architects of violence, would be the last to forgive, and what it would cost them to find peace. Accusations have a way of reshaping ordinary life. Once spoken aloud, they want someone to act on them, and in their wake they rearrange loyalties. For Caldwin Hawke, waking was only the first victory. The next had been reclaiming the confidence to accuse and the courage to confront. As legalities circled and witnesses were called, the family's polished facade began to show fissures. Nathaniel's arrest was a televised spectacle, a captioned drama for a world that fed on scandal. But the court of public opinion is fickle. Charges are only as permanent as the evidence that holds them. Eveline watched Caldwin through this transition with a clinical curiosity that held warmth beneath it. He had moments of brittle defiance, the old steel of his corporate persona resurfacing when he felt stripped of power, intermingled with tremors of vulnerability when forced to confront the betrayal at the heart of his life. "I built things," he told her one evening, voice low and raw, "places that people depended on, power that people coveted. I never thought my life could be so disposable." She had never before been pulled into the theater of one man's public unraveling. Yet the intimacy cultivated in quiet hospital rooms proved sturdier than gossip. They spent hours talking strategy and consequence, but also what the future might look like when the noise quieted. Caldwin, she corrected the mispronunciation in her head, his name was Caldwin, had often lived as if the world revolved around him. The accident had stripped him to elemental truths, fragility, reliance, and the precarious nature of trust. The legal battle proceeded in fits and starts. Documents that once lay hidden in vaults were now summoned into daylight. Emails, ledger entries, hand-signed memos that seemed mundane until linked to motive. Nathaniel's defense, predictably, was twofold: incompetence of the prosecution and familial melodrama. But human behavior leaves traces, and evidence is a patient detective. The prosecution's star witness was a private investigator who had trailed funds and connected dots. Payments to intermediaries, transfers labeled vaguely as consulting, and the shadowy figure who'd stood by the roadside in the crash reconstruction. The press circled like hungry birds. Photos of the Hawke family, immaculately dressed, faces chiseled into varying degrees of despair and indifference, filled tabloids and news crawls. Caldwin found himself alternately defended and abandoned by people who had once thrived on his decisions. Some board members left their positions. Others clung to power, whispering that stability in the company mattered more than personal drama. The business world, cold and efficient, executed an economy of loyalty. Against that grinding noise stood the smaller human acts. Eveline discovered Caldwin's habit of pressing his hand against his chest when he felt anxious, a talisman of sorts. He began to attend therapy more consistently, learning to name emotions rather than drown them in directives. He learned to sit in silence without filling it with orders. The small victories of character felt weightier now than the reclamation of a title. Yet, as revelations continued to unfold, not all answers satisfied. At times, the law's slow cadence frustrated him. He wanted immediate justice, due process moves at a different pace. Eveline's steadying presence proved crucial. She kept him anchored in routines that mattered. Meals at regular hours, modest walks along the hospital garden, a weekly reading of old, favorite books. She reminded him to be human in a world that demanded he be spectacle. One night, after a particularly grueling deposition, Caldwin asked a question that surprised her. If all this is true, if Nathaniel did it, what does it mean for me? Evelyn considered. It means you were targeted, she said finally. But what else? He shook his head. I mean, what kind of life? Now that I've seen how fragile it all is. I don't want to go back to being someone who takes everything for granted. Her response was simple but honest. You get to choose, she said. You can rebuild with the same tools, or you can use this time to reconsider what you want to preserve. The following weeks were filled with choices. Caldwin took the helm in a different spirit, less about dominance, more about stewardship. He instituted changes, philanthropic programs, transparency measures at the company, a renewed focus on employee welfare. Whether these were sincere, performative, or part of a temporizing strategy would be judged later. For now, they were small acts of contrition. Nathaniel's trial yielded mixtures of triumph and compromise. The prosecution's case, assembled like a mosaic of motive and logistics, was persuasive to many. Yet the defense exploited technicalities, and the verdict reflected the law's complexity, a conviction on conspiracy to harm but uncertainty on direct intent. Nathaniel's sentence was neither the closure Caldwin hoped for, nor an absolution. It was, in the end, an imperfect halting place. As the legal dust settled, the Hawke family faced a new landscape. Relationships had been strained or severed. Trust had eroded into careful caution. In their place, new dynamics formed. Alliances grounded less on blood and more on shared aspiration or necessity. Caldwin, for his part, attempted to navigate these shifts with sincerity. Eveline observed these transitions as a professional who had grown personally invested. The man she tended was not the same titan of industry who once dominated boardrooms. He was someone who had been upended and who chose, in small yet deliberate ways, to rise differently. He spent afternoons mentoring younger employees, visiting the hospital's oncology ward to understand institutional needs, and opening channels of communication within his company. Those acts, small and large, transformed how others viewed him. They were gestures that carried authentic weight because they were rooted in lived vulnerability. Evelyn felt a profound respect for his commitment to change. She did not romanticize his struggle. She recognized it as work, hard, messy, sustained work. Their friendship, complex, tender, professional, became the spine of his recovery. One quiet afternoon, as leaves gathered in small amber drifts outside the hospital garden, Caldwin turned to Eveline and said softly, "You saved me more than once." She looked at him without theatrics. "Maybe we saved each other," she replied. It was a sentiment that felt both true and carefully measured. They had navigated betrayal, legal entanglement, and the slow, stubborn business of repairing a human life. The road ahead was uncertain. Relationships needed mending. Company culture required vigilance. But the foundations for a different kind of future had been laid, tender and hopeful, by choices made under pressure. Healing did not mean forgetting. Caldwin's recovery, though profound, was threaded with aftershocks. The man who returned to public life did so with more caution and a sharper sense of moral urgency. Yet the ripples of the attempt on his life had traveled beyond the family and the courtroom. They had altered the fabric of his business, strained friendships, and shifted loyalties in quiet, sometimes dangerous ways. When new policies at Hawke Enterprises emphasized ethical sourcing and employee welfare, they were applauded publicly. But inside the company's quieter corridors, change unsettled old arrangements. Suppliers who had prospered from lax oversight found squeezed. Intermediaries who had once benefited from shadowy contracts found their avenues closed. Profit centers recalibrated, and money, honest or otherwise, sought alternative channels. Small men with sharp appetites circle opportunity like dogs at a carcass. Someone who had once profited from the company's opacity now watched revenue streams narrow and opportunity vanish. It was an expected consequence of good governance, but also a reminder that making amends can unsettle entrenched interests that prefer the dark. Meanwhile, the Hawke family had to reckon with the way power had previously insulated them from consequences. Nathaniel's sentencing, a partial victory, tempered by legal wrangling, left a vacuum in which others tried to claim advantage. Board members jockeyed for influence. Old allies eyed new alignments. Caldwin, navigating frailty and newfound humility, had to relearn how to be decisive without being domineering. Evelyn, who had never sought the limelight, found herself pulled into the fray in ways that tested her resolve. She became a quiet confidant and, at times, a moral mirror Caldwell relied on. Her counsel was practical and humane. Insist on transparency, treat employees as people first, and accept that the company's culture must reflect the ethics it preaches. There were nights she lay awake contemplating the swirl of ethics and consequence. Was it possible to remake an institution by decree? Or did culture resist such swift redesign, reasserting old patterns that privilege profit over people? She knew the answers were messy and slow. She also knew small things, payroll policy changes, town hall forums, the reallocation of discretionary funds to worker safety. Could, over time, rewrite expectations. Outside the company, old enemies lurked. An organization that had once profited quietly from hazardous shortcuts now found its business endangered. Those with vested interests quietly fomented countermeasures, legal challenges, smear campaigns, and the subtle sabotage of new contracts. Caldwin's integrity, once an asset, was recast as naive by critics who preferred market success to ethical rigor. The strain of this friction took a toll. There were late nights when Caldwin's patience snapped, when he would retreat into the private rooms of the estate and chain-smoke his anxieties away. Evelyn would find him there sometimes, a silhouette in a downcast lamp, and offer food or silence. Whatever his public role, privately he grappled with the gravity of choices made under duress. Then, in an unexpected twist, a whistleblower surfaced from within the company's supply chain. Documents arrived anonymously at a local paper, laying out in stark terms the extent of hazardous practices ignored under successive leaderships. For the board, it was a crisis. For Caldwin, it was a confirmation and a challenge. Instead of spinning, he leaned into admitting past failures and instituting oversight with the ruthless honesty of a man who had once ruled by conquest, but now wanted to heal. The public's response was cautiously approving. It is easier to forgive a leader who admits fault than one who deflects. Shareholders reacted with a mixed bag. Short-term stock tremors followed initial panic, but a longer-term narrative of responsible leadership garnered trust. Employees, many of whom had longed for recognition beyond paychecks, felt emboldened. They organized, they petitioned for better conditions, and they were finally being heard. Evelyn's role evolved further. She was asked to help oversee a new initiative at the company focused on healthcare and employee well-being. It was an unlikely promotion for a nurse, and though she had no taste for titles, she accepted. The work allowed her to bring clinical perspective to corporate policy, advocating for mental health days, safer working environments, and transparent reporting channels. These changes would not erase past harms, but they were practical steps toward rebuilding trust. Through it all, a quiet companionship grew between her and Caldwin. It never took the shape of melodrama. It was a steady, mutual support system. They shared long, candid talks about responsibility and the small, concrete ways people could choose to be kinder. They walked in the hospital gardens and the estate's lesser-tended paths, talking about the banalities of the day and the moral calculus of rebuilding a life. Yet danger, even when exposed to sunlight, has a way of lingering in corners. Someone who had lost more than income might still hope to regain it through desperate measures. Evelyn kept a wary eye on the people around them. She insisted on security audits, anonymous reporting, and in-house investigators to sniff out corruption. Others called it paranoia. She called it prudence informed by insight. When a late-night call came, an unmarked tip about an attempted break-in at one of the company's smaller warehouses, Evelyn sprang into action with the reflexes of a nurse and the resolve of someone who had seen how small betrayals can cascade. The police found nothing but disarray, a few broken locks and the furtive tracks of someone who had been spooked into flight. Yet the message was clear. Shifting the balance of power invites resistance. As autumn yielded to winter, the company began to stabilize in its new posture. Employee morale slowly improved. Investors regained confidence. Community relationships that had once frayed began to mend. It was not a transformation achieved by a single act, but by 1,000 small, painstaking changes. Evelyn watched as systems adjusted, as humans adapted, and as a culture once inclined toward opacity turned, however imperfectly, toward accountability. She also watched Caldwin in this season of consolidation. He had been given an unwished-for second life, and instead of returning to old comforts, he chose diligence. With each meeting, with each apology and each policy fixed, he rebuilt something more durable than wealth. A reputation anchored to compassion. It was, she thought, the truest form of power. When the dust of legal scuffles settled and the corporate world resumed its relentless churn, Caldwin found space to breathe and to choose. He transformed his role at Hawke Enterprises into something less about dominion and more about duty. Boardrooms that once echoed with his ironclad directives now heard different words: transparency, community, and care. He launched initiatives that invested in workers' safety, created scholarship funds for employees' children, and established channels for whistleblowers that protected anonymity. It was a deliberate rehearsal of contrition and change. Evelyn watched him with a mixture of admiration and caution. She had seen the softening in him, the way he began to measure success not by quarterly gains, but by human impact. Yet she also knew how easily narratives can be manipulated by optics. Sincerity needed to be matched by stubborn persistence. Caldwin seemed to understand that. He moved forward with a humility that did not discard ambition, but redirected it toward better ends. In the quieter hours, late afternoons when the estate's terraces bathed in golden light, they would walk together, speaking of small things. A childhood memory, the taste of a particular tea, the way rain felt on their faces. Their bond was not sudden fireworks nor cinematic confession. It was the slow accrual of shared trials, whispered confidences, and mutual rescue. They learned to like the companionship for its steadiness. Then one evening, under a sky where the city's lights shimmered like a scatter of distant constellations, Caldwin led her to the estate's rooftop garden. The world below hummed with ordinary life. Up here, the air felt cleaner, their breaths slower. He took her hand, and for a moment the bustle of business and law and scandal dissolved. "I never thought this would be possible," he said, voice thick with something that could have been vulnerability or the residue of trauma. Evelyn looked at him with a mixture of humor and sharpness. "You have a flair for the dramatic," she teased lightly. He smiled, then grew sober. "I've had time to think," he said, "about what matters and what I've taken for granted. When I was out of it, you stayed. You showed up in a world where many didn't. You treated me as human when I was less than whole." Her throat knotted. "You've done more than survive," she replied. "You've chosen to look at the consequences, and I want to choose better." He paused, then reached into his jacket. When he bent to one knee, the moment carried no pretense of grandiosity, only a simplicity that felt like an answer to an unspoken question. Inside the box lay a ring more classical than ostentatious, an unadorned band that suggested permanence rather than spectacle. "Eveline Mora," he said, voice steadier than his hands. "Will you marry me?" It felt less like a proclamation and more like a promise, a commitment to walk a future where power would be balanced by humility, where mistakes would be met with repair, where shared tenderness would be a chosen ethic. She accepted, laughter and tears braided in a reaction that was human and unstruck. They embraced, and for the first time in a long while, both of them exhaled. Their wedding was small, not the ostentatious affair tabloids had once speculated about, but an intimate celebration held in the estate's conservatory. White roses and warm light, a modest guest list of family, friends, and people who had been part of their recovery. The vows they exchanged were not grandiose promises to change the world overnight, but humble commitments to honesty, to listening, and to accountability. Guests commented later that it seemed less like a ceremony and more like the sealing of a shared covenant. Afterward, married life adopted an everyday rhythm. There were family tensions to navigate, contractual obligations to fulfill, and boardroom decisions that still required his attention, but there was also a joy in the mundane. Sharing coffee in the morning, walking the dog Caldwin insisted on getting, a lively golden retriever that followed them like an extra heartbeat, and reading in the same room without needing to speak. Their partnership became a quiet force, steady and unflashy. Eveline took to the role of advocate within the company with new vigor. She chaired a committee that sought to integrate health initiatives into employee benefits, mental health suppliers, on-site clinics, and regular safety audits. Caldwin supported her not as an overlord, but as a partner, listening to arguments and asking questions with humility. They hosted town hall meetings where employees could speak directly to leadership, creating forums that replaced rumor with conversation. Results were slow but tangible. Fewer incidents, increased worker satisfaction, and new recruitment pools who valued the company's mission. It proved the principle Eveline had always suspected, that ethical choices, when sustained, can become competitive advantages rather than liabilities. Of course, life was not a neat arc. Old enemies continued to lurk. Legal battles, attempts to undermine reforms, and the ever-present media curiosity. But Caldwin had built new alliances, community leaders, non-profit partners, and employees who felt genuinely invested in the company's future. That network created a protective resilience that was harder to dismantle. Eveline sometimes caught herself marveling at how different things were from the sterile beginnings of their acquaintance at a hospital bedside. She had come to that room as a nurse doing her duty. She found herself now living as a partner, shaping the moral compass of a major enterprise. The irony was not lost on her. A nurse helping to steer a conglomerate toward humanity. As winter melted into spring, brighter days arrived. The company's philanthropic programs were underway. A small hospital wing funded by Hawke Enterprises welcomed its first patients, and the estate's gardens hummed with new life. Caldwin's second act, born from survival, tempered by loss, and channeled into stewardship, took shape in ways both practical and profound. They were far from perfect. The world remained complicated, and the ghosts of the past sometimes drifted in the wake of their lives. But together they had formed a quiet covenant, to live intentionally, to accept responsibility, and to be better because of what they had endured. In the hush of twilight on the rooftop garden, with the city lights soft and the promise of morning ahead, they stood hand in hand and felt at last that they had chosen a path worth walking. The wedding bells had barely settled dust when new responsibilities settled comfortably on their shoulders. Parenthood, they agreed, might wait. There were initiatives to launch, policies to oversee, and the simple task of learning the language of shared domestic life. Caldwin returned to his work with a renewed ethic, not as an autocrat, but as a steward. Evelyn continued her advocacy, embedding healthcare into the company's core identity. There was a visible change in how Hawke Enterprises operated. Safety metrics improved. Employee turnover dropped as workers found their voice and saw it respected. Local communities, once wary of corporate promises, welcomed the company's involvement in education and healthcare. It was not the sort of transformation wrought overnight, but the cumulative power of listening and acting. They had their personal rituals too. Sunday mornings became sacred. The two of them walking the dog, visiting the farmer's market, bringing back a basket of bread and flowers. Caldwin took pleasure in mundane acts, learning to fold laundry efficiently, remembering anniversaries without frantic notes, and learning the names of neighbors. Evelyn delighted in the way he approached small kindnesses with genuine attention. It was the kind of happiness that was steady rather than explosive, durable rather than performative. Life, predictably, posed new tests. A sudden audit at a subsidiary uncovered a compliance issue. A former board member attempted to wrest control in a proxy bassi. A rival company launched a smear campaign resurfacing old allegations. Yet each challenge was a smaller battle now because they faced it together with the scaffolding of trust they had built. Caldwin spoke at public forums not to reclaim a throne but to model vulnerability, admitting the company's mistakes while outlining concrete remedies. Evelyn, now a respected voice within corporate wellness, testified before committees on worker health and safety. Her background as a practitioner lent credibility to her recommendations, and she drafted programs that other companies began to emulate. She never sought glory. She found satisfaction in seeing practical changes, fewer workplace injuries, better access to mental health professionals, and employees who felt seen. To her, these were the truest measures of success. Gradually, the Hawke name shifted in public perception. No longer synonymous solely with austere wealth, it began to evoke a complicated but ultimately human narrative of a man who survived an attempted murder, of a company that chose accountability over expedience, and of a woman whose compassion reshaped institutional priorities. It was a story that resonated because it was messy and real. In quieter private moments, Caldwin spoke with Evelyn about the things he had learned. "I wasted time prioritizing the wrong goals," he confessed once, watching sunlight filter through the blinds. "I thought success was a mountain to conquer. I didn't notice the people who were carrying it." She touched his hand. "We're not perfect," she reminded him, "but we are trying to be present." Their life unfolded in small epiphanies, the way an employee told them, eyes wet, that the healthcare fund had saved her child's treatment. The way a former skeptic nodded when a new policy improved workplace safety. A retired nurse who saw the company's clinics and asked to volunteer. These were the private metrics that mattered more than headlines. Years passed, and with them came an ebbing of scandal's echo. Nathaniel's time in custody became a chapter closed but not forgotten. He and Caldwin maintained a cautious, distant civility. Some wounds healed, others remained as reminders that trust, once fractured, takes time and sometimes the passage of years to rebloom. Evelyn and Caldwin continued to host small gatherings in the conservatory, inviting neighbors, activists, and employees. The conservatory, once a sterile echo of opulence, became a place of conversation, laughter, and planning. They funded scholarships, built a small community clinic, and partnered with non-profits to support local health initiatives. Their home was no longer merely a residence. It was a modest hub for civic engagement. On an ordinary autumn afternoon, as golden leaves drifted into piles along the estate paths, they walked hand in hand through the garden. The dog bounded ahead, tail a metronome of joy. They paused at the bench where Caldwin had first proposed and sat. Around them the world carried on. Market vendors shouting prices, school children laughing in the distance, the steady pulse of a city that had once been merely a silhouette beyond hospital windows. "Do you ever think about how one moment changed everything?" Caldwin asked, voice soft. Evelyn considered. "All the time," she said, "but I also think about the alternatives. Maybe we would have been fine in our separate lanes. Then again, maybe we never would have learned to do things differently." He squeezed her hand. "I am grateful," he said simply, "for your presence, for the way you held me." She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and call of breath. "We mended what we could," she replied, "and we kept trying." They sat in that deliberate, quiet way people do when storms have passed and the sky has cleared enough to see the horizon. Theirs was not an incandescent fairy tale. It was a careful, compassionate life stitched together by small, persistent acts. Both had been changed, wounded, healed, remade, and both carried scars that told where they had been. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft, forgiving light over the estate, they rose and walked back toward the house. Inside, there would be dinner, and the soft glow of lamps, the low murmur of playlists selected with mutual care, and the comfortable silence of two people who had chosen to rebuild. The future remained uncertain, as always, but it felt like theirs to shape. The story did not end with a grand flourish. It rarely does. Instead, it continued, less dramatic now, more human, another day at a time. And in the small acts of care, advocacy, and tenderness, they discovered the truest kind of fortune. A life shaped by meaning rather than mere possession, by repair rather than escape.